So shall I pray and then let's take our time this evening. So, yeah, Father, we just give you this time we've got this evening, and um, and Jesus, it's interesting how easy it is when we live in this vast universe that's got so much of interest in it, and yet so easy for people to get disengaged with life. And Lord, there's something about the looking for you, despite all of the other things that we could think about, all the other things we could look at. And I think about that phrase where C.S. Lewis says, "It's not that I've found the light and found Jesus, but Jesus is the light by which I find everything else." And so Jesus, just as we take time to think about you this evening, think about your story, we do just look with expectation that actually it kind of engages us with life, Lord, makes us thrill at everything that you've created. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Good. So, well, it was a long time. Was it? Or was it last month? We were looking at session 5, and we were looking at the Last Supper. So I'm doing these sessions at a kind of slightly slower pace than when I do them live. I was just down in Ashburnham last week, and it's probably worth just flagging because I now have. I was going to say, here you go. I've got a complete set of oh, there you go. Complete set of manuals now to cover the life of Jesus, which I'm really pleased with. I say with this kind of smug look on my face. Although having said that, of course, what's happened is as I've sat down and gone through them, I'm seeing all the mistakes in them, which no doubt, Liz, you would pick up because you're very good at that when I give out notes and saying, "Oh, that's the wrong verse." But you get to that thing, you got them together, but they are there, and that's a real, from my point of view, that's a real step forwards. And part of the thing, having them nicely done like this, what I would ask is just from that kind of partnership level, please pray we find the right way of getting it into more hands now, because it's part of the step of trying to get these things out, to start offering it to other churches and so on. So it's nice to have those. I was really pleased with doing that. But one of the things I found when I was doing the sessions at Ashburnham, where we did 3 days in a row, so one on the birth and early narratives, one on the kind of the ministry years, and then final day on the last week, is that the speed we were doing them at, it seemed like it had less content than some of the early ones. Liz, you were saying you were at one of the first ones I did up in London like this, and back in those days I think there was more material in there, but in one sense, as your or my knowledge of or understanding and the nuances of this last week grow, you've got to get more things in, but a slightly more shallow level. So you feel the stuff that gets left out. So it's quite nice to be able to do these at this slightly slower pace. Oh, the other thing I should say while we're here is, look, also that is the new book. It actually does exist now, and that arrived last week. So that will be on its way to you if you're not there on Saturday. Anyone that's there on Saturday, I will hand one over. Otherwise, we'll send it to you in the post. So there you go. That's marketing out of the way. If we move on to this tonight's teaching, so tonight we're going to look at the arrest and the Jewish part of the trial of Jesus, and it's one of those. This particular period. It is kind of well understood, let's put it that way, in terms of when I've kind of done these presentations. There are moments that are a surprise to people, putting the Last Supper on the Wednesday, making the full trial last 2 days, but today we're only going to get through the first day, so that's kind of what people tend to think of as the trial. But it's one of those things that is so crucial to the Christian story that we all kind of know it well, but it's useful just to see, and I think there are a number of little moments in it that just for me always kind of stand out and raise questions. And so as we go through tonight, I'll just kind of highlight some of those things. So where are we? So we broke off last time with Jesus breaking bread at the Last Supper. And we kind of emphasised last time, I think, and touching on it last week at Ashburnham, that the issue of taking bread and wine is actually just part of the Passover meal. So in Jesus' day, and that today wine is sometimes taken 5 times. In Jesus' day, the cup was taken 4 times, but the bread equally seems to, if we take the kind of rhythms we have, we think yes, they seem to be from Jesus' period. Bread seems to have been broken at least 3 occasions, and we get that as we kind of piece the Gospels together. That this wasn't just a one-off event; it was somehow Jesus teaching into the context of this kind of continual process of remembering the promises of Passover, which you do with the cup, and the breaking of bread to represent the kind of the fellowship around that. And in that kind of context, it kind of finishes with the very last breaking of bread and the last drinking of the wine. But Jesus has been kind of picking up the themes of that right the way through the evening. And so as we get to that final one, that's the point, I think, where they sing the Great Hallel. It's the final hymn of Passover, which we kind of see represented, obviously, as we go through the Gospels. So Mark 14, so before leaving they sang a hymn, and that's kind of coming to the conclusion of the formal meal. And that fits what we know and understand of Passover meals, the Seder meal, in the days of Jesus. So they sing that hymn, and then they move on out to the Mount of Olives, which probably means it's around 11 p.m. As we looked, it was about 7 where sundown has happened, and it's about just after 7 where sundown has happened, and therefore they can kind of come together for the meal. And it's a slow meal with various rituals and other things in it. And then, of course, we know from John's Gospel that in that context Jesus has taught quite extensively, and he's shared quite intimately and given quite a bit of challenge to his disciples in terms of explaining his going and coming back, and so on and so forth. So it's probably therefore going to be around 11 at the point where they're singing their final hymn and coming together for the end of the meal. And we kind of we read about them kind of then heading out towards Gethsemane. If you've got a copy of the manual we've done to hand, then you can see obviously the integrated text here. I've just got the quote from John. So then Jesus spoke in these words: "They went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden in which he entered with his disciples." Just a quick thing, if anyone, as partners, and because you're doing these, if you haven't got one, our legal status on manuals is they cost a fair bit to print. We tend to do them when we're doing a teaching session, but because you're going through the teaching, you can have one if you just let us know, and we do it on a kind of a gift basis. So we're not making a formal cost to partners, but it's just to kind of help cover the postage and the fact they cost a bit to produce. So if you haven't got one, you can always talk to Anne, we'll get you one. But anyway, just coming back to the John 18. So they head on through that map that's kind of from the book, or you'll have seen it. They've come out. I'm pointing at my screen, which of course you can't see me when I'm pointing at, but at the bottom corner there is the Essene Gate, which has been well excavated, and we fully understand it. I have said it's possible that they go through the centre of the city, but it makes more sense that they come out through there and they walk around the edges of Jerusalem. And so it's about a 40-minute to roughly where they think the garden is. You know, in modern tourism, there's a couple of potential sites for the garden, but the region is roughly, we're pretty sure of the region. It makes most sense. So and of course it's there. Oh yes, and they get there, and it's in that context, obviously, that Jesus does fall asleep. Sorry, not Jesus falls asleep. Jesus' disciples fall asleep. But what's kind of interesting, and which I've highlighted in red, in terms of just how we put the storytelling together, is it seems that there might be members of Jesus' kind of wider leadership group already there. I've actually got the page open here because I haven't got it on the PowerPoint slide. So as you're kind of reading it, so it says, Jesus, knowing that all these things were happening to him, went forth and said, oh no, that's the wrong page. Oh, it's the previous page. Yeah, here we go. Then Jesus came to a place called Gethsemane. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So the first thing is Judas knows where it is, and it's because it's a place where the disciples have often been. where he met with them. So, and of course, at this stage of Jesus' ministry, the discipleship group is wider than the 12. Now, it's unlikely that it's much wider than the 12 when they've eaten Passover, because that's about the right number for eating Passover together. But now, as Jesus goes to the garden, it's possible that there are others there. And I put in kind of brackets there, there's John, Mark and Luke, because both John, Mark and Luke have kind of contributions in their Gospels. So John Mark obviously is the writer of Mark's Gospel, and Luke as the author of his Gospel, obviously, and both who are considered to be members of the 72 by all of the early church lists. So in every list that you find in the early church, they are common, they're right up the front as key members of the 72. And so as members of the 72, it's possible that the reason they're able to see some more eyewitnessy details that kind of seem to belong uniquely to them is because they may be there presently. Obviously, the John Mark detail is the young man who runs away naked. And the question is, what's he doing naked in the garden? Although it may still seem a little odd, it makes more sense if he's actually asleep. So it's much more a question of actually he's kind of wrapped himself in the sheet for the night, as he's been already asleep there, and Jesus has turned up with the other disciples, so he's wearing the sheet because he's in that kind of state of semi-sleep. Because do you remember that Josephus has told us that up to 2 million pilgrims have come for the feast, and there was a lady who was an ex-RE teacher this last week at Ashburnham who was clarifying for me quite firmly that the 2 million that Josephus talks about are men only, so that it could have been a lot more when you took in women and children, because Josephus only apparently refers to the males as the pilgrims. So there's a couple of million people, and there's 120,000 living in the city. Normally, there's an awful lot of people camping on the hillsides out and around about, as we've been thinking in the weeks where Jesus is coming in. And so it wouldn't be surprising to find part of his wider group in a location that they have used on multiple occasions. It may even be that actually, as is part of the tradition, that if the garden belongs to John Mark's family, if it's linked to the house where they've eaten, that John Mark is deliberately, that's why he's sleeping there, staying there. If Luke is a member of the 72, then as well, and so both of them are, maybe that by arrangement they're staying there. So whether when Jesus first turns up there, he knows there will be some other disciples, or whether they're just there, it does seem to me like a good working hypothesis that there are at least a few other of that wider group of disciples there in the garden already. So Jesus gets there, but it's the 12 who are in focus when he asks them to stay and watch with him while he goes, and he goes a little bit further afield, and he prays through, and they're falling asleep. I've got here about him sweating blood, but I wanted to just, because we're taking it a bit slower, I'm going to read the kind of the integrated text again that we put together. So he went forward a little, he fell on his face on the ground and prayed that if it were possible the hour might pass away from him. And it's so easy to kind of read those words because we know them so well, but actually we're seeing something about Jesus's prayer life and the intensity of the moment, which we've not had anywhere else. Him falling on his face on the ground. We know that it's his habit to go off early in the morning to pray, and he's taught his disciples how to pray. And that prayer that he's taught them is a place of kind of more intimacy, whereas this one is much more one of anguish, and kind of wrestling with the Lord. And that's an important kind of little moment to capture, because it's an interesting thing that, because some of you may be following the series I'm doing through the Sermon on the Mount, where we're looking at what we know from modern psychology. Because an awful lot from modern psychology is actually showing us that very often what we think of as the good life is only possible with certain amounts of struggle and tension in it. In other words, there's something in the human makeup that is designed for effort, if I can put it that way. But we enjoy effort so much that we think that, if you like, God's perfect life for us is an easy one. And here, because obviously of the kind of the conflict of the cross, we see Jesus in his humanity engaging in the effort, which is kind of a part of real human life. and is a part of our prayer life. So falling on his face and kind of crying out in the situation and saying, if it's possible, the hour would pass away from him. Abba, my Father, if it's possible, and all things are possible for you, and if you're willing, please remove this cup. Let it pass from me, but nevertheless, not what I desire, not my will, but what your desire, and yours be done. And so then he comes to the first disciples for the first time, and they're asleep. And he says, couldn't you watch with me now? Watch and pray, and don't enter into temptation. And then we have that famous quote, because the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And that I really like that phrase, and we so often use it as a bit of a jokey excuse. Oh well, spirit's willing, flesh is weak. But it captures something of the dynamic, and in a slightly less focused way. But I prefer the less focused than when Paul talks about the good that I would do I don't, and my sinful human nature, and so on. And that's often been developed kind of in Western kind of theology, and sinful human nature becomes this kind of broken, corrupt thing, and it's being replaced by the Spirit of Jesus. But I see something similar here, but less kind of, if you like, tight and focused than that, which is just in the way we're made. The spirit, if you like, the freedom, the free will, the ability to stand back from a situation and make a choice, is very much kind of subject to a much kind of deeper, woven in subconscious process to our humanity, which is kind of hardwired to do the thing with the least effort. And so it's kind of I read it, I hear the words from Jesus as a kind of compassionate recognition that actually, and the way Paul, because he's kind of in that challenge, he says, the fact that I would choose it is kind of proof that I do know what is right, and therefore I ought to have done it. But Jesus kind of is recognizing that at the subconscious level of being human, our brains are wired to look for options that save energy, conserve energy, and therefore we can want to stay awake. But actually there's a kind of we have this huge amount of processing, because the kind of the top part of the brain where we make those kind of decisions burns energy at quite a rate, so we only use it for short periods of time. So as soon as that gets turned off, it's like the auto instincts take over, and they're falling asleep. So it does get right at the, if you like, this story of the prayer and the falling asleep is getting right at some of the nuances and the strangeness of how we are, if I can put it that way, of what humanity is like. Jesus is doing it well. We're doing it, or the disciples are doing it in a very kind of human way. So again, the second time Jesus goes away and prays, and saying the same words, and says, if this cup can pass away, but lest I drink it, and your desire be done. He comes again. And then after that second one, we read that there's an angel comes to strengthen him. And being in agony, he prays more earnestly. And it's at that point we then read, and he sweats blood. And this is one of those kind of moments, because Luke seems to know about it. We don't read about it in any of the other Gospels. That doesn't necessarily mean the others didn't see it, but they didn't necessarily understand it, and somehow the detail has got lost. But for some reason, Luke is very aware of it, and I say for some reason because he is a doctor, and while he may not have fully understood the phenomena, it's of interest to him in that kind of medical sense. He's seen Jesus in agony, anguish on the floor, on his face, struggling with the process. And in that kind of context, Jesus goes through something that we understand now, which is the phenomena of hematotrosis, or bloody sweat. It's now, although it's incredibly rare and almost nobody will ever see it, it is kind of a well understood process. I'm saying that it's a well understood, but I suddenly realised when I was thinking about this evening, I haven't actually checked myself whether it's to do with increased blood pressure that breaks the capillaries in the sweat glands, or whether it's kind of pressure from the outside squeezing down. But for whatever reason, the pressure within the sweat gland breaks the blood vessels, which allows blood to get into the sweat. And anyone that's been to any of the live things, you've seen the quote before, but I always like to put them in when you find them from a good secular source. So that the New Testament indicates Jesus underwent hematotrosis before the crucifixion of Jesus, during the agony of the garden. These claims are plausible. That's very kind of them. These claims are plausible. I would say a bit more than that. It's not just that the claims are plausible, given that modern-day dermatological research notes the presence of hematotrosis in people awaiting execution. I think it's more than that, because it's one of those things that you have to explain. If at least the events of the garden, you may deny the resurrection, but it's difficult to say there was not an eyewitness in the garden, just given how well this fits the context of somebody facing their own impending execution. And Jesus has become very aware of it in that kind of context. We see him in the real struggle. We see heaven breaking in with the comfort of an angel coming in. And it's in that context that we hit what I think is one of the most surprising verses. I won't say it's the most surprising, because I'm constantly amazed how a verse every now and again just catches you. You go, oh, I never really thought about that. But the surprising kind of verse, which kind of then comes because Judas is going to turn up and Jesus is going to comment in a minute, so I'll save it till we get there. But so in all of that struggle, and then the breakthrough of the angelic, there's something settled in Jesus, because at the point that Judas now turns up, we find Jesus in a very calm and very sensible but very realistic, facing what's about to come kind of state. So Judas arrives with a party of temple guards and soldiers. So as we were thinking probably last time, so long ago now, I forgot what we were thinking of, but Judas, when he's left the Last Supper, the other disciples initially have thought that he was going to make an offering in the temple. Well, that's kind of standard, it seems, within that kind of context. They're close enough that somebody should leave and make an offering. They wondered if he's gone to do something like that, but he's probably gone up to Caiaphas, to Annas's house. We can assume that because we're going to see he's with Annas's main steward. So he's gone to Annas's house. They have talked during the week about presenting Jesus for arrest, but we'll think about what Judas thought about that in a second. But they presented him that they need to get hold of Jesus, but it will cause a riot because the crowds have been so with him. And of course Judas couldn't betray him before the Last Supper, because he didn't know where the Last Supper was going to be, because of the strange way in which Jesus arranged how it was going to take place. Go and find the man carrying water and it will be in his house. So he's got to that house, and during the evening he's perhaps become aware, he perhaps recognises the hosts of the house, if it is John Mark's family, and so when there's plans that we're going to later retire to the garden to pray, he knows where that is. So he leaves at that point, goes to Annas and says, I know where Jesus is going to be. But he can't just go to the temple and ask for a temple guard. He needs to take Malchus with him as authentication. Once they have a temple guard, technically the temple guard has jurisdiction in the immediate area around the temple. They will go out onto some of the roads, but not much further. So if they're going to make an arrest a bit further afield in the Garden of Gethsemane, then they actually need a Roman escort. So they have to go up to the fort of Antonia once he's got the temple guard. So we need to go. It's for religious duties, religious matters. Therefore, it's legitimate that we do it. But to keep the peace, we have to have you with us. And so a sizable number of soldiers come. Luke refers to a cohort, which can be up to 600 soldiers. And you think, why on earth 600? Well, it doesn't say it's all of them. It's enough, though, that is legitimate for Luke to use the phrase a cohort comes, which probably means there is a couple of hundred or a few hundred at least. But what we forget, of course, is we are going into an environment where there are 1 million people camped out around Jerusalem. There are no street lights. They know roughly the location, but actually they're going to have to make a perimeter to be sure that they capture Jesus. And so it's not a trivial job. It's not a trivial thing to kind of just turn up with a torch and be able to walk straight and find him, and for him not to be able to run away and to slip away. And so they've obviously made the case that we need a sizable number of Roman soldiers with us as well to make probably a wider cordon as we go to the garden. And so that's Judas turns up, it doesn't mean that the whole cohort is immediately with him. They will be in that kind of spread out way. They're not. It's not like kind of, I often make this comment. It's not like when you see children playing football and everybody follows the ball. Jesus is the ball that they're focusing on, but they are a proper team. They're well organised, the Roman soldiers, so they're probably in the much wider environment in case Jesus tries to make a run for it or slip away in the dark. And into this kind of context, then Jesus, knowing all these things were happening to him, went forth and said to them, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas also, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When therefore he said, "I am he," they went back and fell to the ground. It's just one of those little kind of theophany moments where there's something about the revelation of who Jesus is. But the one who's called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them, and when he had come, he immediately came near to Jesus to kiss him and said, "Hail, Rabbi." And kissed, or Rabbi, Rabbi, we get from, I think that one's from Mark, the double Rabbi, and kissed him. But Jesus said, "Judas, friend, why are you here? Did you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" And again, therefore, Jesus asked, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these others go their way, that the word might be fulfilled which he spoke. Of those whom you've given me, I've lost none." And it's interesting just to note that, this isn't the surprise verse, but it's worth commenting on, because here is John quoting it, "Of those whom you've given me, I've lost none." Those words are quoted by Jesus when he's been praying. So Jesus has been praying when he's in the garden and the disciples are falling asleep, and makes the statement, "Of those that you give me, I've lost none except." And that little "except," of course, is here Judas. So there's a kind of a caveat. It's here, "Of those that you've lost me, I've lost none except the one we've already covered." And I guess because everyone here has a background. We've all kind of grew up in Ichthus, so we're kind of very aware probably of the non-fixedness of the nature of these things. But unfortunately, the NIV, when Jesus is praying, says of Judas that "I've lost none except the one who was doomed to fulfill the scripture." And so it makes the verb very purposeful and uses the word "doomed," which is going way, at one level, it's going way beyond what the Greek actually says, and it's also being far more precise in its grammar. So it's doomed to fulfill the scripture, whereas in I'm kind of slightly paraphrasing because I think I'm doing it from memory now, but I think in the New American Standard it has more along the lines of the one who perished fulfilling the scripture, and the verb is non-purposeful. It's something that happened while they're in the process, and that makes sense because there is no scripture that says one of Jesus's disciples will be eternally damned while as a result of being a disciple, or there is no scripture for that. There is a scripture which we've covered last time, which says that one of Jesus's disciples will lift his foot against him and will betray him. Those are part of the prophetic context. So what Jesus seems to be saying when he prays is, in the context of fulfilling those scriptures, actually something has happened to Judas, but the bit that happened to him is not necessarily therefore an eternally inevitable consequence. It's something about the pride of Judas in the moment that actually puts him in a position he can't come back from. Whereas Peter, on the other hand, he's in a similar kind of place in one sense, because he's going to deny Jesus 3 times, but he is going to find a way back. And when we get to the resurrection morning, I want to touch on that, because we know that on the resurrection morning, kind of actually, because we have 2 accounts that puts Peter's meeting with Jesus, which is private. We don't ever read an account of it, but the 2 accounts that list it put it in exactly the same kind of time location. And in that context, therefore, it looks like Peter has deliberately kind of gone back to the tomb on his own when he has heard the testimony of Mary that Jesus has risen. Mary and John, it seems, set out to go and tell the other disciples, but Peter takes a detour, goes back to the tomb, it seems, most likely location, and it's in that context that he re-meets Jesus, and there's a kind of the beginning of the rehabilitation. Obviously, when the disciples then go to Galilee, Jesus completes that process by making those 3 statements to Peter, and he's kind of drawn back in. So Peter is like Judas. He's in a place where Judas betrays, Peter denies, but Peter actually takes the initiative to go back to the tomb. It seems to take that time out and re-meets with Jesus. Judas seems to be stuck with his pride and won't come back, and that's the kind of the tragedy. But I'm just kind of really drawing out that little kind of those you've given me, I've lost none is of course qualified, because Jesus prayed it earlier with the except the one who perished, fulfilling the scripture. So in this context, though, as we keep going, and they came and they laid hands on Jesus, we come to what I think is I find one of the most intriguing verses. And they took and seized him, and when those who were around him saw what had happened, they, which the disciples, said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" Because I've integrated the text, we go through it a few times. And behold, a certain one of those who were with Jesus, Simon Peter, having a sword, stretched out his hand, drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and struck or cut off his ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. And Jesus answered, "Let me at least do this." So in other words, in that arrested place, he's seen what's happened. Let me at least do this last thing. And he touched his ear and healed him. And of course, this becomes Jesus' last miracle. Obviously, the resurrection is a miracle, but that's probably something that the Father does. Into my hands I commit my spirit. It's not purely it's something that Jesus does. It's something that actually this is the kind of Father's initiative. This is the last, if you like, miracle of Jesus' initiative. So Jesus then, of course, speaks to Peter, says, "Put the sword back in its sheath. All those that take up the sword will die by the sword." Again, I love the couplets and the sound bites that Jesus gives us, because they really do work. Those that live by the sword die by it. And then he says, "The cup that the Father has given me, should I not drink it? And don't you think," and this is the verse I really like, "don't you think I could ask my Father, and even now he would send me more than 12 legions of angels? But then how then would the scripture be filled? Because it must be so." But if Jesus is telling the truth, it must have been a possibility. And that's why I say it's kind of intriguing. Jesus has prayed earlier and said, "Not my will, but yours." So he has already established, if you like, in his prayer relationship with the Father, that in my humanity, as I'm in this place, I'm submitting my will to you. But as he expresses it here, there has to be something in there which, had he not been prepared or able to fully submit that, if he had to hold on to something of his own priority, then what he is saying is that the Father would have, and it would have caused a problem for Scripture. In other words, all of those prophecies that when we do the Old Testament series, that run from Genesis page 1 right the way through to the last verse of Malachi 6:4. That all those things that are said about they all kind of hinge on this moment. The cross is the nux moment, the crux moment. they all kind of focus on there, and what Jesus is saying. But actually, if I had not been going through this willingly, if I had not been in that place whereby my choice I've submitted, then the Father would not be forcing me through it. He would be sending 12 legions of angels, and almost it's kind of, forget the fact that he prophesied it. Now, I know that's hard to get hold of, but I can remember I flagged this with a number of young guys way back when I was leading the church, and one of them went off to university and flagged this in a kind of Bible study, and said, he contacted me afterwards because he said, "I need a little bit more help on this, because I got so shouted down by people who said that's impossible, it must mean something else." But it seems to be quite plain to me, and what it shows in many ways is if you like, the supreme kind of confidence of the Lord in the light of the uncertainty, even perhaps to himself, if I can put this in a way that doesn't sound reducing of the Lord. But we ask those questions, And what would happen if you have an immovable object and an irresistible force? What would be the result? And there must be a kind of a sense, if you like, within the idea of the Trinity, where we have three persons in one Godhead, where there are tensions which, in them, if you like, in themselves, are things therefore that can't be known until they've happened. There's something, if you like, of that. That's what I mean. There's the kind of the supreme confidence in the risk taking, that I know you so well that even though it is total freedom and you are different, the Son is different from the Father, the Spirit is different from the Son, even in that dynamic dance which we call the Trinity, therefore there is both a confidence in the quality without certain knowledge of the detail, if I can put it those ways. I'm probably overstating it now, but I just want to get across. I sometimes feel that some of the most interesting elements of our faith are the things where we find, if you like, a tension that is only known as we kind of contemplate the tension of these things. And so I always like those kind of verses, so that's why I like to point them out. So we get that one right in this kind of key moment as the arrest is taking place. Jesus gives this incredibly deep sort of theological insight to ponder over, to try and get our heads around. And while we may never settle on exactly how it works, somehow in trying to balance it, in the skill of trying to kind of get this thing on the balance, we perceive something of the way in which our freedom works with the omnipotence and omniscience of a good God. Can't always put it tight down to kind of simple analogous logic, but we kind of get hold of it by feeling it. So anyway, I need to move on. So Jesus said to them, the multitudes, i.e., because there are a lot. And just notice, actually interesting, the multitudes, that word comes from Matthew's Gospel. You can see because it's highlighted in purple. So Luke is the one that said there's a whole cohort of soldiers. We know that the temple guard only has, I think it's 21 or 23 members. I think it's 21. 3 of them are priests and the others are Levites. So they hardly constitute a multitude, but actually we get that hint that confirms what Luke's told us, that there's a large crowd here with this phrase, the multitudes. If you come out against a mob with swords and clubs to seize me, I was daily in the temple teaching. There's a beautiful kind of calm irony to the way Jesus spells it out to them. I was there in the last few days, I've been there teaching, and you didn't arrest me there, didn't stretch your hand against me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. And again, that's got a kind of an amazing kind of punctuating moment, isn't it? You can imagine, and if you're thinking of it kind of visually, this is your hour and the power of darkness. But all this has happened so the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And at that point we read, then the disciples left him and fled. Well, that's the last thing they remember him saying. So we don't know any more of the conversation that Jesus has with the guards, because of the fact they've all run away, and that probably includes initially John and Peter. I mean, John has just chopped off the servant's ear. He's feeling embarrassed a little bit because Jesus has then stepped in and told him, not to do it, and you'll live by the sword, you die by the sword. And of course, Peter's not sure what's going to happen to him, so he has initially got out of the way. John probably has as well, although the two of them are going to turn around. They're not there to hear anymore. And so they seized him, Jesus, led him away and brought him to the high priest's house. So that high priest's house, of course, is a bit ambiguous. Is that Caiaphas? Is it Annas's? Do they share it? Do they one share an apartment in the others? John's going to tell us it's Annas's house. Annas was the high priest, and then he was deposed by the Romans, but of course there is no idea of a high priest being deposed. They're supposed to be high priest for life, so although they put another high priest in, Annas still considered himself high priest. So it's probably a reference to Annas's house directly. But then Peter followed from a distance, and a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth. So it seems that John, who's not John Mark, this is probably in that point where he, as the soldiers have taken them off and he's been asleep in the garden, he kind of gets up and starts to follow them, and one of the soldiers, spotting him, grabs at him, and so he lets go of the cloth and runs away naked. So you never know. Peter may have seen that, which might make him a bit more cautious as he kind of follows on. So Peter and John are following Jesus down at this stage, whereas the others, of course, are heading in different directions. And the obvious direction, because they're on the Mount of Olives, is to continue heading east. There's no point heading back west. That's the way that the soldiers are taking Jesus. They're on the road that goes to the west and then goes to the north. And the temple guard will likely go straight through the temple precinct to get to Annas's house. Annas lives in the highest part of Jerusalem. And there's a valley there's Kidron Valley that runs right the way through Jerusalem. And to avoid the ups and downs, if you go into the temple, there was a large kind of bridge that kind of bridged across, so you could walk across that. So it's likely that they would head straight into the temple, across the kind of precincts, over the bridge, straight into the higher part of the upper city, to take Jesus to Annas' house, which is directly, therefore, west. To the north is the fort of Antonia, and most of the soldiers would probably head up there. So the guards that we're going to read about at Annas' house will be the temple guard in this situation. So it doesn't make sense for the disciples to go in those directions. So it only leaves two, that's south and east. And as we're going to, as it seems in the time that follows, the majority seem to head east towards Bethany, which of course is where they have been staying for the last week. So it makes sense. I put there that Thomas goes further afield, and the young man who starts by following but then runs off naked, we don't know where he went. But there. So Jesus is taken towards Jerusalem. Peter are now trailing them, and they get taken to Annas's house for the discovery period. So it's not the full trial. This is just for the kind of the period of kind of working out how they're going to prosecute Jesus as they get there. Now I've put here starting at 3 a.m. It may be that this happens while they're there. It's not, doesn't have to. I just, for poetic reasons, say if it starts around 3 a.m. there is this trumpet blast for the change of the guard at the fort of Antonia, which they call the cock's crow. So the statement that Jesus makes about before a cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times, in Mark's gospel it highlights twice, and it may be that what this is the other was the one that is the blast on the trumpet, or it may just simply be that kind of statement that early in the morning there's an initial crow and then there's another. But I quite like the idea poetically of they seem to arrive they're probably arriving about the time. So we thought they left the Last Supper probably around 11. Jesus is praying for over an hour before he's arrested. It's kind of pushing in towards 2, maybe towards 3. But as they arrive at the house, Peter, of course, is going to deny Jesus 3 times under 3 distinct interrogations. It's not quite as straightforward as when I tried to work it out, and I have a solution in the manual, but it's one of those I'm going to revisit because it could go. You could read it a couple of different ways. So when in a kind of the options I have here is that 3 occasions are when Peter is standing by the fire at the cock's crow, i.e. at 3 in the morning. So in this scenario, what it means is we take from John's gospel, the statement was when they first arrive, but actually we see it's kind of been telescoped a little bit. It's not necessarily immediately as they arrive, but it's the woman who lets them in at the door who then approaches Peter at the fireplace, at the fire, and so that may be where the cock crow happens, the 3 o'clock moment. That's one way, or you could make hers the first occasion, and then we kind of gather some of the others around the fire. But fundamentally, so in which case you get a slight different possible way of the order going. I mean, these things are trivial, but just if you like to do these things. So it's either that the first one is at the door, then at the fireplace, then on the porch, 3 different locations, or it is that Peter comes in, he's at the fire. First one is at the fire, then he moves away to the darker area and he gets challenged there, denies it, and then the third one comes there. you can kind of, it can be kind of go either way. The key thing really though is the last one, which is at which point we see everyone's coming together. The woman servant is saying it, and the soldiers that have been saying it, they've all kind of started, they're coming saying, no, you really are. And of course that's the point where Jesus looks over at Peter. But those three things are going to happen. And you've all seen these images before, but in case they ever go online, just more for general consumption, we'll put them up. This is the kind of floor plan of the large kind of priestly mansion. That it's interesting. Last week, some of the folks who are there have actually been here and actually been to this building, so they were talking about that. And you can kind of sort of see in the kind of cutaways. I put where Malchus is round the fire with the temple guard. That kind of is the central courtyard. I put Peter in the corner there. I put John up on a rampart. We don't know where John is, watching in, and Jesus in this inner room. Again, I'm pointing at it. You can't see my finger pointing at it, but Jesus is there in the inner room, and you get that kind of wonderful kind of little moment, but which I often think it's details like this that make the gospel so genuinely history. Which is as a vantage point to stand, if this is the house, if this is Anas's house, then actually the vantage point where that woman is standing in the image, you can stand there, and when it's dark outside, you can't see the person looking in from the inside. The light in the room blinds you to who's outside, so there can be someone standing directly there looking kind of straight in, and you won't be able to see them, which means that Peter can have a really good view of the interrogation that Annas is giving to Jesus, and he's asking about, and so we have details. He's asking about the disciples. He's making challenges to him. He gets struck by one of the guards and so on, and Peter has the opportunity to witness some of this. But as the daylight kind of comes, and maybe the cock crows once, and then the light is kind of there, and then it crows another time, and then suddenly there is Peter denying Jesus. But now, because the daylight has come, when you're now inside, the contrast between what seemed like really bright lamplight when everything else was really dark, now that the sun is beginning to appear, suddenly what's outside is a lot brighter than what's inside, and so now you can see clearly to the outside. And so it's a little kind of that nuance of the way in which light works that makes so much sense of the narrative that the Gospels give us, that of the fact that Peter is somehow able to observe and hear and see the interrogation that's kind of going on. And then suddenly there is a moment where Peter and Jesus are able to look and make eye contact. And of course, in that moment, Peter remembers all of his bravado from earlier in the night. It would never be me. And there's all of those things that Jesus said about the one who was going to betray him, and must be going through Peter's head. Am I the one who betrayed him? I was saying it wouldn't be me. I made that promise. I made that commitment several times during the evening. If you go back and look at the text, Peter's saying that. And he doesn't know that it's Judas. Well, he probably, no, I suppose he does. He does know it's Judas because Judas has turned up. But he must be asking questions of himself. And that as the light kind of comes and we get that line of sight. So I just think it's one of those really nice moments that make you realize you're reading a real story, real history, not a made-up. Although that might happen in a modern made-up story, that level of sophistication in storytelling in the ancient world just wasn't there. The things were much more myth-like, saga-like in kind of made-up stories. This is kind of real dynamic life. With that kind of the way those things flow. And so certainly Peter disappears at that point. We then read that Jesus is sent to Caiaphas. I put there around 8 a.m. It may not be as late as that. It's probably earlier. Dawn is before 6 at this time of year, apparently. So it's probably before 8. How long John stays, I don't know. It's worth just a comment on that, actually. Sorry, I should have said when they arrive at the courtyard is this is a large kind of working house. So there is a degree. It's not that it's all fully open for anyone to walk in. And we know from the excavation of Peter's house in Capernaum that actually he is right at the head of a kind of a significant fishing company. It's got multiple rooms, and again, some of the people I had last week have actually been there, and they were just emphasising how enormous the site is and how it has multiple. I've read in the descriptions, but I've not myself been able to visit these places. That the house that's been excavated and is kind of so certainly Peter's house that even biblical archaeology today says, it's that they will never say 100%, but they kind of say it's hard to imagine it's not being. It's a significant fishing industry, and John, of course, is a partner. So John is part of his probably kind of cooperative business. Probably Peter is probably at the heart of a conglomerate of fishing boats, and John is a part of that. And so in the centre kind of Kidron Valley, as it runs through the kind of lower part, if you remember going way back when we were looking at the city, is the area where the artisans tend to keep houses and various different trades and so on. And so as a large significant fishing business, they probably have got access to properties there that they use. So John has a family house probably, and probably Peter as well. And as we heard before, there seems to be the inference that John the Gospel writer is also from a priestly family. And so they would understand how to have access into the kind of public parts of this kind of large building, which is the kind of priestly the priestly kind of compound. Say priestly compound is the high priest's kind of estate. And so they're probably able to move in that sense. John, who is known to them, gets Peter in. They are therefore part, if you like, of they can present themselves as kind of part of the trading community that kind of bringing stuff in right the way through the night and so on. And so it's into that context that they were able to get into the property. But John disappears off. Sorry, Peter has disappeared off. John stays long enough to see that Jesus is being sent to Caiaphas, and he probably at that point needs to go off to find Jesus' family. As we've thought before, if John is Jesus' cousin, and the trade guilds and different kind of different areas of work tend to main properties and locations. I mean, the Tyropean, is that the right word? Tyropean Valley area, the lower city. Then Jesus' family is likely to be kind of in the environments of the same place where John's property is likely to be held. It's in the same sort of region as kind of visiting artisans coming into that context. And John would know how to make contact with them, so he realizes that he needs to go and inform them what's going on. And so at which point, of course, both Peter and John leave the eyewitness scenario. Jesus is taken to Caiaphas, and we have no detail because we have no eyewitness until Jesus is presented then before the Sanhedrin. When he gets in front of the Sanhedrin, the Council of Elders, so in Luke we're told, so when it was day, so night has come, morning has come, it's now daytime, the Council of Elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council. So from Caiaphas's house, Caiaphas would then formally take Jesus to the council chamber. You'll find people arguing as to whether this stage the council is meeting in the temple or whether it's in the priestly mansion. It doesn't really matter to in my view. I tend to put it in the temple, but there's some reference in one of the rabbinic writings about kind of a ban on those meetings, but they will still be meeting. And so Jesus is taken into that context, but it's now morning. The arrest that has been made now has kicked into action the plans of the senior members of the Sanhedrin, who have plotted to do this and have taken the initiative. Now have to go and raise the wider Sanhedrin, not all who hold so firmly to the solution that Gamaliel has presented, that better that one should die on behalf of the people. But they need to raise everybody, and they need to because they're not totally corrupt. They, as is often the way, For when good people do bad things. I think Richard Dawkins once said that you need religion to do that. It's not religion. You just need people who hold strongly to an idea that overrides. Then that becomes the logic that allows you to do bad things. So it happens with atheists, and it happens with religious people as well. If you've got in atheists, you only need to look at kind of communist Russia. You just need to have an idea that allows you to validate every action, and you can do some appalling things. John le Carrier has that in in The Spy Who Comes In From the Cold. I think that's part of the dialogue when they're when they're kind of interrogating the British spy character. They make the point that that actually the way that the Russians despise the West is because the West doesn't really have a guiding principle. So when they kill someone, it's anti their Christian heritage. He actually makes this point. Whereas when they kill someone, it's just for the sake of the good of the people, because that's their overarching. The people have become their overarching idea. So why am I'm kind of making that point, because the Sanhedrin don't behave totally immorally. They do try and go through the requirements of the legal system they have, even though they have already decided where they want to get to with that. But they can't allow themselves just to do it. For their own integrity, they have to kind of behave according to the norms which they say they're upholding. So they go through those things. So it's daytime now. So the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him. They blindfolded him and struck him on the face. Prophesy, who is it? They spoke. And Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So this is so he goes from John's house to Annas's, and then to the council chamber. So Caiaphas is now presiding. It's daytime, so it's now a legal trial. In which case there are witnesses and there's a semblance of formality. So there are rules that have got to be followed. They're written down in the Mishnah, which is written down a couple of hundred years later, but the rules haven't changed. The rules were kind of the same. These are the rules of how these are new rules for the Sanhedrin. It was the Mishnah's recording. This is how they conduct trials. So we know from the Mishnah that trials have to be held during the daytime, which it is. The sun has come, it's a new day. Verdict has to be reached during the daytime, which it is reached. In a capital case, you can acquit on the same day, but a conviction has to be confirmed the next day, which is why we need that extra day. So it's why we see the Last Supper is on the Wednesday night, not the Thursday night, as traditionally has been the way. As a result, therefore, of course, you can't hold the trial on the eve of a Sabbath or the eve of any other feast day, and you can't actually hold it on the feast day itself. So there are those kind of limits, but actually they have enough time to get this through, because they already know where they want to get to, but they're going to have to they know they'll have to confirm the next day. So chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony. So you get the sense as you read in Matthew that this is taking time. It's not something instantaneous, but they have got the whole day. So they kept trying, so they might put him to death, but they didn't find any, even though many false witnesses came forwards. But later, two came forward and said, this man stated, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. And again, it's one of these wonderful little moments, because this is Matthew's gospel. I mean, in John's gospel, we know when Jesus said that. He said it right at the beginning of his ministry, back in 30 AD, so 3 years ago. Passover 3 years ago. And who is it who would have heard him? Well, it will be one of the temple guards, because that's what they say to him when they kind of duff him up and chuck him out of the temple, because he's saying that he will destroy the temple in 3 days and rebuild it, and they kind of mock him and say, well, it's been developed for the last 46 years. So we know where that conversation is, and we know that the people involved in it are the temple guard, who are the people who, of course, arrested Jesus. But somehow or other, even though it was 3 years ago, so they brought witness after witness, they say things, and because the cross-examination will be going on within the Sanhedrin, which includes people like Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who are not as anti-Jesus as the majority are, while they're going to reach a verdict, well, they are going to get there unanimously, but they're trying to get there by majority. Not everybody is instantly sold on the idea that Jesus needs to die. Many of them would just say, well, lock him up for the feast, that kind of solution. But in this so they bring people in, and their testimony falls apart as they're challenged by the different members of the Sanhedrin. But eventually someone kind of remembers within the temple guard, well, I remember him saying this, and they bring those forward. And they say, and they challenge Jesus, don't you answer? But Jesus kept silent, so he's quiet on that, because the truth of the matter is he did say it. It was 3 years ago. And the accusation is coming from the same probably people who've arrested him, but it is true. And then in that context, again, the high priest keeps pushing him because he just stays silent on it and says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And it's interesting because it's Jesus who gives them what they need, and Jesus says, "I am." So he uses the ego eimi, as the Septuagint does when God says, I am, who sent you. So I am. I am, and you see the Son of Man sitting in the right hand of power and coming from the clouds of heaven. And it's a loose quote from Daniel, and it's really interesting because right the way through his ministry, Jesus has referred to himself as the Son of Man. But the phrase Son of Man, in its most kind of common usage, is just like saying I'm Joe Everybody, son of Adam. You know, as in the Narnia stories, son of Adam, daughter of Eve. It just means I'm kind of Mr. Human, and that's a really appropriate thing for Jesus to express in the terms of his ministry. Although he's divine, he's laid aside the rights of divinity, and he's expressing that everything he's doing in his humanity. But the title Son of Man in Daniel is given a twist, because there it's someone who looks like the Son of Man, but actually they seem to be divine. And so the Son of Man is also kind of someone who's divine. They kind of look like everybody. That's Son of Man as a general phrase. But here as a title, the Son of Man who sits at the right hand of power and comes in the clouds, is this kind of divine character. And so Jesus has just used an ego eimi, which is the phrase that God uses, and although he'd have said the equivalent in Aramaic, which probably means he would have said I am, and the Greek comes to us that way. And you shall see the Son of Man, that's what I've been calling myself all these times, which is kind of a bit ambiguous, but now I'm letting you know exclusively by quoting from Daniel, I'm understanding the Son of Man with divine significance, and he will sit at the right hand of power. And come in the clouds of heaven, just as you enter the Holy of Holies surrounded by clouds, and there is a seat, which is the mercy seat, and Jesus is in that context talking about the Son of Man who's sitting. And there's probably that kind of that moment where, in one sense, you can imagine Annas, or it'll be Caiaphas actually, who's running the interrogation, suddenly thinks, my goodness, what's he just said? I better make the most of this. So he rips his clothes to make sure nobody can miss what Jesus has just said. Because what Jesus has just said, in the strict kind of terms of the law, is quite outrageous. And says, what further do we have of witnesses? We've all heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And I suspect that all includes, reluctantly, kind of your Nicodemuses and your Joseph of Arimathea, which is, we did hear him say that, and our usual way of understanding our religious heritage would mean we would have to say he is worthy of deserving of death. You can understand that from your legal position without necessarily wanting that to be the case. I think whether it's true or not, but as we often talk in that treason is still apparently a death penalty. If you go and execute the monarch or whatever that. But we wouldn't imagine that actually any judge would actually think like that nowadays. But we might still say, but the legal system, he is according to that. Then that's a penalty that can still have the death penalty that goes with it. That's a crime that has the death penalty. So they are unanimous in understanding him being deserving of death in that kind of context. So at that point, Jesus gets taken into custody, and he's held, and while arrangements are made to go to Pilate. So we don't know when it is. I've put there it's Thursday afternoon. But that actually gives them time. First of all, they've got to wait till tomorrow, and then they've got to meet again, and they've got to convict Jesus a second time. So, because remember, we saw from the Mishnah that the rules are you can acquit on one day, but if you're going to convict, you you come to your verdict, but you have to confirm it the next day. So they know that next morning they've got to do two things. They've got to re-meet, they've got to finalise their conviction. They don't need to go through the arguments again. They just got to say, yes, we still believe this is the right solution. And then they've got to present Jesus to Pilate, because they don't have the authority to commute that sentence. And so I'm just drawing out the fact that to do so, according to Roman law, they have to have petitioned Pilate in advance. So they have to have sent someone down to say, we found him guilty today, we'll be bringing him to you tomorrow, and we need it done quickly, so we need to book an appointment, and so on. So Jesus gets taken away, and we have the reason why most histories over nearly 2 millennia have missed the fact that the trial takes place on 2 days is because, in one sense, we forget the fact. You see, if the Gospels were made up by people who weren't eyewitnesses, as often the modern theory is nowadays, they would be quite happy to kind of fill in details that they made up in Jesus's kind of incarceration. But because they're not, there was no one who was a witness. Jesus was probably locked in a dark room. The temple guard aren't going to tell us anything. They probably weren't even listening in that much. So Jesus is just there on his own. And so in the Gospels, those kind of hours sort of just disappear. So we kind of forget that they're there, and that's why we kind of concertina the trial into 1 day instead of it being there for the 2. So Jesus is in that context, but we have no details, and that again is another testimony to the fact that the Gospels are telling a true story. They're not filling in the bits that they don't know with stuff they couldn't know. Sorry, this is a slide left over from one of the live presentations. It's a photo opportunity, time for a break, where it's not time for a break, although we're pretty much finished for the evening. But I just want to get us at least through to the next morning, and then we'll stop there. So Jesus was kept in custody for the rest of that day. And they take him to Pilate early the next morning. So early Friday morning, I've got your kind of characters in different places, which again is a slide from when I've done the live presentations. So I'm just going to skip over. So immediately when morning had come, all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes and the whole council held a consultation. You see, why are they doing that? That's because they have to. That's what the Mishnah says. They took, or the way that Matthew puts it, they took counsel against him. So they meet with the objective of confirming their verdict from the day before, to have him put to death. So the whole company rose up, bound him and led him and carried him away and delivered him before Pontius Pilate, the governor. So they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium. It was early. They themselves didn't enter, that they might not be defiled, but they could eat the Passover. I'm just thinking how many slides. I think we're about to finish. So, because I'm probably going to save Pilate's. We'll just do a couple of comments on Pilate, and then we'll finish for tonight, and we'll do the trial under Pilate, Herod, and then back to Pilate and the crucifixion next time. So, at some point during the morning, it's probably not first thing, but at some point, straight away, Pilate recognised. He probably spotted it the day before. You can imagine the petition is brought to Pilate, and he's aware that he's going to have this preacher that he would no doubt have heard of, who's been so popular up in Galilee. And he suddenly thinks, actually, I've got an opportunity here, because a couple of years prior to this, he has lost face with Tiberius, with the emperor, because what's happened is he was installed by Sejanus, who was very anti-Semitic, and he's pursued very aggressive policies towards the Jews under the patronage of Sejanus. Sejanus is Tiberius's heir, and Tiberius is semi-retired to the island of Capri, and he's been running the empire and taking a very hard line with Jews, objecting to them the whole time. And Pilate, he's helped put Pilate in place, and Pilate has pursued that policy. And a few years before, what had happened is Pilate had to finish the aqueduct, and so he'd forcibly taken money from the temple treasury to finish the aqueduct. But then Tiberius has come back out of retirement, and Sejanus has been executed because he's been told that there's a coup being planned by Sejanus, and the policy has all shifted. And at that point, Herod Antipas, who is king in Galilee, so his father Herod the Great was king over in Judea and Galilee, but the kingdom was broken up. So Herod Antipas has taken the opportunity to kind of spoil Pilate's copy card, if you like, by complaining to Tiberius about when he took money from the temple and all the trouble it caused. And so Pilate has a black mark because Herod has kind of played this political game. So I can't help but think that when Pilate recognizes that Jesus is from Galilee, he sees the opportunity to kind of just play one back against someone who's played one of those little political games with him, which is, this is going to be contentious. I know what that Herod is like, but actually he comes from Galilee, so let's give him the problem. And so Pilate tries sending him to Herod. And of course Herod finds no guilt in Jesus, and sends him back to Pilate. Although I've got a couple more slides, I'm going to save the time with Pilate. I was going to finish to this slide, obviously Jesus being led off for crucifixion. But I think it'd be worth taking a little bit longer on Herod and the dynamics next time, so I'll kind of leave it there. But hopefully you're kind of, well, I say hopefully, I feel kind of like, as I'm talking to you, all of you guys have probably been to things I've done before, so you've heard a lot of the material before. But my hope and the kind of prayer always is we more and more we kind of get to know the intimate details of this story. We kind of I enjoy conjecturing about it in a reasonable way. I mean, you get a lot of conjecture, but a lot of it's just kind of totally kind of made up out of the blue, it seems to me. That's very judgmental. What we want to try and do is kind of conjecture within what we actually know from history is the kind of social context. Because actually, in doing so, you start to see the humanity of Jesus and the reality of the interpersonal kind of dynamics. And so my prayer, in one sense, is that's why I do these things. Is I want people to feel the kind of confidence that this is a very real piece of history that we're dealing with. But anyway, does anyone want to ask anything or make a comment? It's all quiet because everyone's turned their microphones off. Hopefully you're all still there. It looks like you all are. So Jason, Liz, and Derek and Angie. No. So from that, I'm going to take it that you've all fallen asleep while I've been talking. Oh no!
Still trying to take it all in.
Yeah. I know. I always talk too much, don't I, Derek? That's the thing.
I couldn't possibly say that.
You can. Yeah, Judith does all the time. She tells me that.